Welcome, Agent Smith.
Oh, hey.
What's up, dude? How's the week
not
been?
much.
The usual?
Mixed bag.
Yeah.
Made some money, but just about broke my foot, so up and down.
Were you getting paid to kick people?
No, no such luck. Just proofreading. A couple of proofreading gigs.
Who did you have to kick while you were proofreading?
No, I just was groggy one morning and jammed my foot into an exercise bike.
Damn, that's tough. Well, I hope you recover quickly. I had the thumb injury from saving Milo from a dog attack fairly recently, but aside from that,
Really?
in good health. Yeah, did we not tell you about that? It was a while
No.
back. Yeah, the dog park is kind of a anyone can get in. You don't need a gate key or anything. So there was just another individual there who brought a dog that was completely out of control. They were like jumping on me trying to get the tennis ball, and then they try to tackle Milo and snatch the ball from him, and he almost gets it one time, and then they just start going for his throat, and they get fully on top of him, and I had to physically pull the other dog off of him by the collar in the back, and the weight of the dog being on my thumb where the collar was kind of messed up my thumb. It's mostly better now. I would say it's at about 95%. So it doesn't hurt too much, and it was worth looking after the Doge. But that was my first kind of violent interaction with dog kind. That was fun.
Wow.
I don't think the dog was hurt. They were a little bit upset that they were prevented from doing what they wanted to do, but I didn't feel bad about that. I was as gentle as I could have been given the circumstances.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Respect.
Dangerous world out there.
Yep. Milo's safe.
Makes me glad I never leave the house.
Yeah. Stay inside. Food and shelter and internet, and you're good.
Pretty much.
So, what happened this week in the world?
This past week?
This past week.
I don't think there was a whole lot that really was all that interesting to me, anyway. The big thing I had was actually from a couple weeks ago, I think. It was Recep Erdogan from Turkey passed a decree that expanded presidential power. And there was a whole bunch of stuff in that. You know, he's been planning on shifting to more of a shifting Turkey's government to more of a presidential system for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it was thought that after the referendum that he won that would allow that, it would take until maybe October or so to kind of really get that going. But he's kind of jumped ahead a bit with this presidential decree that's given him more powers over things like Turkey's intelligence agency and implemented some other changes. What I've got my notes here. So the intelligence agency is now going to be directly controlled by the president instead of the prime minister. Because again, it's not a presidential system yet, so of course it would have been controlled by the prime minister, who would, in the previous system, was head of government. So this decree changes that immediately, rather than waiting for a more overarching constitutional change that would officially make Turkey a presidential system. The decree also makes it so that whoever is head of the Turkish intelligence agency can only be investigated or questioned on the okay of the president. So nobody can investigate him unless Erdogan is okay with it, which is pretty convenient.
Yeah. Well, to me it seems like that classic question that a leader can ask, which is, wouldn't we all be better off if I had more power? Because I feel like I understand what should be different, and it's true that with bureaucracy there are a lot of layers and a lot of different moving parts that can go wrong, and there's that thing that always happens with leaders that have a lot of power is they say, well, I feel like I know how it should be. If I just made it so I had more power, then I could get it done faster. But that's very dangerous.
Yeah, that's a big part of having a liberal political culture, and that's, you know, again, classical liberalism. Part of liberal political culture is recognizing that very fact and engaging, limiting yourself and your ambitions and the ambit of what you do with your political power. A lot of the stability in developed countries, democratic developed countries, stems, institutions play a big part in their stability, but it's also just partly political culture, liberal democratic cultural norms that are recognized and adhered to by political elites. And often, we've talked about this before, so this is kind of beating a dead horse, but it is really important. There are some things that politicians don't do just because it's traditional not to do them, and stability is, liberal democratic norms are very conducive to stability in that regard because they do reinforce that. Whereas in a place like Turkey, where those norms are not as entrenched in the political culture, there's not as much holding people back. And in the case of a person who is obviously well organized and very willful and very skilled at politics, like Recep Erdogan, they can leverage that lack of norms into a lot of personal power. And these decrees are a big part of that.
I wouldn't really say beating a dead horse with the norms of classical liberalism, that sort of thing, because that's only recently news to me. And I would say there's a solid core of people who get to watch all of these or listen to all of these episodes with you, but we have a lot of new viewers too, so some of those core concepts that keep coming up, I think it's good to review them and revisit them. And the horse is alive because we have classical liberalism as like one of the dominating political types on the planet, and seeing how those interact with others and how the norms change over time is one of the most interesting aspects of the story of how human governments are continuing to change.
Yeah, liberalism is easily the preeminent global ideology. It's basically the ideology that has defined how the world order, such as there is, has been constructed and designed, and it's also kind of become the norm by which countries and their political cultures and systems are judged. Mm-hmm. If a country is democratic, it's better than, say, another country that is less democratic. That's just sort of the barometer. And you don't have to be a good democracy. You don't have to be like a top, a really mature liberal democracy to kind of pass muster to avoid too much scrutiny, because obviously there are a lot of flawed democracies, or as you might call them, illiberal democracies around the world. But any country that is explicitly not democratic, that country comes in for special sanction and attention from the world community. And that speaks to the degree to which liberalism has kind of been ingrained as a norm in terms of global political culture. So it's definitely, like you say, very significant. And in my opinion, it's not a bad ideology to have, and as far as it pushes good governance and facilitates representative governance. But anyway, some other things that the decree said was, right, the intelligence agency was given power to investigate people in the military, which is a very sensitive thing in Turkey, because of course the military is a very powerful institution in its own right, historically speaking, in Turkey. It has traditionally considered itself the guardian, so to speak, of Turkey. And if Turkish politics have gone, in the opinion of the Turkish military anyway, if Turkish politics are perceived to have gone too awry, then the military historically has used that as justification for a coup, or some other manner of influencing outcomes. And so there was a law passed in 2011 that actually prevented the intelligence agency from investigating the military, and that's apparently in this decree been more or less overturned. And then the intelligence agency also was given the power to remove people in the military if they are investigated with only a 2 weeks notice. And traditionally that's been a very long process. That's a process that that's very bureaucratic and takes several months apparently. But now the bureaucracy has been cut down significantly so that it would only take 2 weeks. So if the intelligence agency wants to come after you and you're in the military, they have much greater scope to do that. Now, whether or not they actually do that, whether or not the intelligence agency, as a proxy of Erdogan, will go after the military, is still not entirely clear, because the changes that he made in these decrees didn't really do a lot in terms of changing the actual military. Like, the intelligence agency has been more of a civilian agency. And so this is just sort of solidifying his personal control over it, rather than shifting it away from the military. The military itself continues to be a relatively independent institution. One of the changes the decree did make that was relevant to the military was that higher-ranking officers can be promoted without having fully served the required duration at a given rank. So normally you would have to serve a certain amount of time, I don't know, like a year or 2 years, at a given rank before you can be considered for promotion. With this change, you could be promoted much sooner, just depending on the discretion of a superior officer. And that could be good in so much as it, makes the officer corps more meritocratic. Because instead of, just hiring people based on seniority, basically, you would be hiring them, or at least give people the room, the discretionary power to hire on merit if they so chose. But it could be bad if it's just used to politicize promotions. You could hypothetically give somebody who hasn't served their full term of promotion if you think they're more politically loyal to one group or the other. So that could be very bad for the Turkish military as an institution. And then the military's judicial system was eliminated, which I thought was a pretty bold move. The Turkish military has had its own, basically, judicial system for a long time, and that's not necessarily abnormal. Most militaries have military tribunals, but Turkey's military judicial system, such as it was, has had a reputation for getting involved in politics. Like, for example, in Kurdish areas, whenever martial law is declared in sort of Kurdish areas relating to the conflict there, or historically during one of the coups that the military propagated, the judicial system of the military is what would be used to go after political dissidents or other people who were labeled guerrillas or terrorists. So by taking that power away from the military, you're taking away some of their political power. You're taking away a political tool that they had used to exert political power, rather. So that was a pretty strong move, but not necessarily a controversial one, because even the Turkish military recognizes that in order to build legitimacy of government and rule of law in Turkey, the military can't exert as much political power as it did before, at least not overtly like that. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem they would... I don't think the military necessarily has a big problem with that. I think that's in keeping with their trend over the past few decades of giving more power to the civilian government and moving towards democratization. But we'll see. It could be that the military really doesn't like it and that they're plotting something. You never can tell.
Do the Turkish people have kind of a positive perception of the military and the way that they've historically stepped in and stuff?
Oh God. It depends on who you talk to. I mean, I think we've talked about the composition of Turkey's political parties before. Maybe not on here, but I think in person we did once. And basically the three big political parties, as I remember them, someone in chat can correct me if I'm wrong, but the three big political parties were the AKP, which is sort of a socially conservative but economically liberal political party. They're very pro-business, but they're also sort of socially conservative in the sense that they want to bring back some Islamic norms and cultural traditions that had kind of been suppressed by the Turkish nationalists under Ataturk and his secularist reforms. That's the big party in power right now. That's basically Erdogan's party. And then the other two are, respectively, the Nationalist Party that had more or less ruled instead of the military for much of the Cold War period. And then the only other party is the Ultra-Nationalist Party, the MHP, which is even more rapidly nationalist than the CHP. So there's not really like a big liberal or leftist political party in Turkey that you can kind of lean on, that you can turn to. So in that sense, whether or not you like the military depends on which of those kind of factions you fall in. If you're a nationalist or an ultra-nationalist, you're probably pro-military. But on the other hand, if you're an AKP person, probably not. Because the military and the secular nationalists that ruled Turkey basically as an authoritarian state for much of the 20th century suppressed social conservatives, basically conservative Muslims in Turkey in the pursuit of modernization. And a lot of people didn't like that, but couldn't do anything about it because, again, authoritarian state. There's also a rural-urban divide. There's relatively more of the AKP support comes from rural areas. I also do have a fair amount of urban support, but a lot of those people actually came from rural areas to urban areas for work. People living on sort of the west coast, like Istanbul, west coast, where basically the population centers, they tend to be more liberal, and they tend to be more CHP or MHP or even leftist, in so much as you can be leftist in Turkey. And those people are generally more supportive of the military and very critical of Erdogan. Well, except the socialists. What few socialists there are in Turkey, very critical of everybody, pretty much. But they haven't been as much of a political force in Turkey, as I understand it. There was another change in the decree that I thought was kind of weird. He very specifically gave the foreign minister the power to request, on the president's okay, the ability to transfer foreign prisoners in Turkish jails for Turkish prisoners in overseas jails. And that's kind of telling because Turkey right now has kind of an on-running dispute with Germany regarding some German citizens that the Turkish government has arrested over the past few months. And I think another one even last year that they've been holding for the past year on sort of trumped up terrorism charges, basically people that were critical of the government or that were otherwise doing things that could even be remotely associated with the PKK or any other such thing that the government didn't like. And to a degree, those are kind of pseudo-political crimes, but it also kind of reflects the government's displeasure at Germany for not allowing them to campaign in Germany amongst the Turkish diaspora there for a yes vote on the referendum on whether Turkey would be made a presidential system. Mm-hmm. So that's an on-running dispute, and that kind of gives them the power. This change in terms of extradition gives the Turkish government power to kind of negotiate and use prisoners as political leverage in international negotiations. And that's a very German-specific policy change, it would seem.
Interesting.
And then, of course, he gave a bunch of resources to the national police. Because the national police are considered more loyal to him. He has more direct political control there. By the way,
we talked before about the Turkish-German relationship and how there was that period where a bunch of Turkish workers went to Germany and they thought it was going to be temporary, but ended up being long-term. So they've got that kind of link that a lot of people don't think about, especially Americans. I would never have guessed that.
Yeah, that actually kind of goes back a ways. By the way, am I too loud here? I was listening to the recording last week, and I kind of had a loud, sort of echoey voice.
Yeah, your mic sounds a lot better this week. I don't know what the cause was last week, but it sounds good now.
Okay, just checking. Yeah, that Turco-German relationship actually goes back even further than the German economic miracle, as they call it over there, from the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Even before that, there had kind of been a strategic affinity with Turkey, between Turkey and Germany, from the early 20th century, even before World War I, when Germany kind of strategically aligned a bit with the Ottoman Empire in its sort of dying days for strategic reasons. And so they actually, in order to bolster that alliance, engaged in a lot of trade and economic agreements. And there was even talk about building a railway from Germany through the Danube, basically, region into, what was then Austria-Hungary. From Germany through Austria-Hungary, and then to Istanbul, and then maybe even building a bridge across the Bosphorus Strait into the Asiatic part, Asia Minor, of Turkey, and then having a direct connection with the Middle East, which would have been a big problem for the British, because that would have given the Germans a logistical link to the Middle East that could have been used as a staging point, a launching point for an attack on their holdings in South Asia. Via Persia anyway. They would have had to go through Persia first, but that was still a step in that direction, and that was very disconcerting for the British in that time. I don't think they ever finished that railway, but it does show the degree to which the Ottomans and Germans were on the same page, were sort of in a strategic alliance. And, of course, the Turks were neutral in World War II, so not much going there in terms of Turco-German relations. Obviously, everybody was pretty busy during that time period with other projects. But then after World War II ended, that was when the alliance kind of was rekindled. Both Germany and Turkey ended up in NATO, which is kind of a story in and of itself. And the German economic miracle required a number of workers. There was a worker shortage after the war for obvious reasons. A lot of the men were dead. And so Turkish migrant workers kind of filled the gap and helped the Germans rebuild the country. And the German economy was able to take off significantly as a result with their assistance. So, yeah, that's a brief history of the 20th century alliance between Germany and Turkey. They definitely do have a fair amount of history there. And I think Germans in general might be a little more comfortable with Turks than, say, other Middle Eastern groups for lack of exposure. So something else about Turkey, just to kind of follow up that thing about the decree. AKP support, I read this online, AKP support is apparently flagging a bit in Istanbul. It's kind of falling not a whole lot, but enough to be of concern to the party and to Erdogan. Erdogan apparently flew to Istanbul recently, past couple months, and kind of beretted his party faithful there to do more work to build public support for the party. And the reason it's important that party support is falling in Istanbul is that Istanbul, from what I read, is apparently a bellwether for Turkish politics. As goes Istanbul, so goes the rest of the country politically. And so that is a concern for them. And that could well be very encouraging for critics of Erdogan, since there hasn't been a whole lot to be encouraged by the past couple of years. And apparently some of that discontent in Istanbul stems from environmental management. Apparently a lot of money has been spent on building infrastructure in the city and developing the city. But apparently a lot of that didn't hold up well to this big hailstorm flooding that occurred a few months ago. And that made a lot of people very critical of some of these projects, the very expensive projects. And then also there's inequality. There's a sense that the government has not done enough to uplift poor communities in the city, which is all the more disconcerting for people there because, there is so much economic growth there. There is so much expansion, and yet so little of that, or at least relatively little of that, has been seen by the poorer communities in Istanbul.
I pulled up a map of Turkey here just so we can kind of have a visual aid. So Istanbul on the far west side. The first thing it makes me think of is Russia having Moscow and a lot of their major urban centers on the west side. I can't see the population distribution just from looking at the map, but is it kind of similar where it's heavier on the west side and lighter on the east side?
Yeah, most of the population is kind of clustered along the west coast, kind of by the Aegean Sea there. And then Istanbul is a big major metro area that has a big chunk of the population in its own right. And then the rest is a little more sparsely populated. You'll see some smaller, dense nodes of population kind of on the Black Sea coast, and then on the southern coast on the Mediterranean. And then most of the rest is very sparse, especially in that central plateau. Incidentally, the capital of Turkey, Ankara, is right smack in the middle of Turkey there, or at least pretty close. It's on that central plateau. That's partly for strategic reasons. It's further away from the coast where the country might be attacked. That ended up being important after World War I when Turkey was set to be partitioned, basically. It was meant to be cut up into spheres of influence that were allocated to different European powers, including Greece, Italy, France, and Britain, principally. But the Turks were able to fight what they kind of think of as a war of independence. They actually raised a nationalist army out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire and expelled all of the European occupiers, principally the Greeks. The Greeks, I think, were the only one that had an army in place, actually, to make their claim, so to speak, on their sphere of influence, which was the western quarter of the country or something like that. And the Greeks, when they met resistance, pushed into Turkey to fight that army. And the Turkish army, such as it was, retreated inward into the hinterland and was able to kind of drag out the conflict and eventually defeat the Greek army in a decisive battle. I don't remember what it was called, but I remember talking to a Turk guy in grad school who told me about it. And it was then that the Turks were able to chase them out of Turkey and sort of reclaim their country and ensure Turkish independence for the rest of the 20th century.
Mm. I think that's one of the general themes of a lot of countries' histories, where they have some capital, and then over the course of conflicts or through some national sentiment, they change their capital to a more central location. I think, isn't Brazil an example of that? Brasilia being the capital, and how that it wasn't really a key area in terms of population and what was going on there at the time, but it is more centrally located than the coastal cities.
Yeah, Brasilia is a bullshit city. It was completely artificial, and they literally just made it so that it would be more centrally located and to shift more resources, to shift more economic activity out to the frontier, which at that time was roughly where Brasilia was. Yeah, they also designed the city to look like an airplane. If I remember this story right, the actual city plan set out the city in the shape of an airplane, which at that time was politically significant, because I think this was the 1950s or 60s. Brazil was trying to induce to develop an aeronautics industry. That was considered a big part of the Brazilian government's economic development plan. A lot of Latin American countries at that time, among other countries in the world, had what was called an import substitution economic development program. And what that means is that instead of developing your economy by exporting things that the world economy wants and developing that way, you try to develop your own industries. You protect your economy from competition and try to build up your own industries that employ people and develop, etc. Mm-hmm. And among those was the aeronautics industry, in Brazil's case anyway. And so because that was a big sort of feather in the cap of the Brazilian government, because that was considered a major achievement, because they were making progress in that regard, and the Brazilian aeronautics industry today is one of the few successful such protected industries that emerged from that era. Mm-hmm. They decided to build their new capital in the shape of a plane. It doesn't look like a plane now, I don't think, because now there's a lot of what do they call them? I don't think they call them favelas. I think that's more something on the coast. But they do have these big sort of peasant concentrations of very poor people living in very poor quality housing that have kind of built up around the city.
I think that might be correct. They're kind of like city slums, right?
Slums, there we go.
Yeah.
Slums, that's the word.
Yeah, I saw an article recently about kind of the aftermath of the Rio Olympics and how there were all these amazing plans about how the facilities were going to continue to be kept up and used for other sports teams. And Brazil has really great kind of sports culture of their own, especially with football, what we call soccer. But it's all just basically a huge abandoned ruin now, and it's sad when you consider that a lot of people were displaced to make room for those facilities, and now they're just kind of abandoned and there's nothing going on there anymore. And there were a lot of contractors who built the shit who never got paid, so that's extra bad marks for the administration who decided that, oh yeah, we can do an Olympics, but not in a way that is very great. The British Olympics had its own problem too. It seems like it's such a huge ordeal that everyone's going to mess it up. It's a question of how much are you willing to mess up this area to have the Olympics, and people love the Olympics, so they really want it.
Yeah, don't host the Olympics. It's not worth it. You know, a lot of city authorities want to try to host Olympics because it gives them an excuse to do projects that they'd probably already been wanting to do, or to destroy parts of the city that they don't like and want to get rid of to make room for other things. But really, it's just, even if their projects do have some kind of benefit, it would be much better to just implement those projects through the normal procedures rather than relying on some very disruptive, hugely expensive event like an Olympic Games. You know, the traffic alone, frankly, in my opinion, makes it not worth it, but that's just me.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah, really. Yeah, it's actually even worse than that in the case of Rio, though, because Rio actually bankrupted itself paying for those. They actually declared, I think, bankruptcy or something near it a few years later. And there were a lot of protests in Rio de Janeiro over that. There were actually a lot of protests even during the Olympics, because a lot of people thought, why are we spending so much money on this when we have so many poor people that we could be spending the money on? Yeah, so people were especially upset when they found out that the city had basically blown all of its money on these games and had to actually make cuts to social service.
Well, one of the promises that you hear a lot with the Olympic option of can we host the Olympics, they'll say, oh, it's going to be an economic stimulus and it's going to cause people to want to come in and do business in this area, and it's going to improve a lot of stuff, which we've seen with Beijing and even the London Olympics and now Rio. That does not happen. It's very much the opposite.
Yeah, it's there have been studies done on the economic effects of things like the Olympics, and the effect long term is not very strong. There's some evidence it might increase the economy or stimulate the economy somewhat over time, but it's not a big effect really, from what I've read of it. Yeah, I mean, again, if you're a city, you don't really care about what the economic effect is. You just want to have an excuse. It's a tool, a bludgeon to use against vested interests. Beijing had been wanting to kind of clear out some of the older districts, which were sort of styled in the very old traditional style of Chinese cities. They were very, not quite slums, but they were very cramped together, these very small, cramped together houses. And they took up big chunks of the city. And so the Olympics acted as an excuse for the Beijing authorities to kind of get rid of some of those areas. Yeah, similar in the case of Rio. With Rio, though, I don't think they ended up tearing down a whole lot of favelas. I think more of the innovation there for the Rio City Authority was an excuse to send in the military. There was a big security operation in Rio during and immediately after the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, in order to try to suppress criminal activity, in order to make the city at least relatively safe for all the people coming in for the Olympic Games. And that was marginally successful. Crime went down from what I've read about it. But the trouble was that a lot of the programs that were implemented that helped that program succeed, or made that effort, a lot of the programs that were implemented to make that effort succeed were sort of abandoned or under-resourced after the Olympic Games were over. And so the favelas have kind of returned to form since then, unfortunately. Yeah, not really worth it. Yeah, Greece actually is another example, because Athens hosted the 2004 Olympic Games.
Yep.
And they spent a shit ton of money on that. And as we all know, that ended up kind of hurting them in the long run. The Greek debt has a reputation for a reason. And, obviously spending on social programs, government deficits, things like that, probably comprised the bulk of Greek debt that contributed to the collapse in the Greek debt in the markets and the eventual Euro crisis, as it was called. But some of that was just Olympic Games debt, because I think they spent, a couple $billion on it, something like that. It was a huge amount of money for such a small country. So let's see, there were some questions. So somebody asked if the decree that Erdogan passed is a response to the attempted coup last year. No, the response to the coup last year has been the massive purge of the government in Turkey at all levels of anybody even marginally associated with Gulen. And if you don't know who Gulen is, he's this, what would you call him? I'm struggling to think of the Islamic equivalent of priest. Well, basically, he leads this religious... Imam? Maybe that's it, yeah. Imam. He's the leader of this religious sect in Turkey that's sort of relatively modern, kind of modernist Islam, if you want to call it that. And his principal activity, starting in the 1970s, was building a large school system in Turkey. And Gulenist schools were considered very good quality, and they produced a number of generally pretty successful professionals and civil servants over the course of the past few decades. But as a result, because Gulen is associated with the coup, and because there was a huge falling out between Gulen and Erdogan a few years ago, anybody even remotely associated with those schools is getting thrown out of their job as teachers or police or whatever they're doing in government. They're being foisted out and forced to find a new job, which is not always easy for these people. And long story short, that's what it was. If you're wondering why there was a falling out between Erdogan and Gulen, it's because maybe Gulen himself, but at the very least it would seem some of the people that formed networks in his schools got into police or the military and started tapping phones, which allowed Erdogan, because they had an alliance with Erdogan at first, that allowed Erdogan to kind of clamp down on the ultranationalists in the Turkish military, whom were rather opposed to Erdogan and the AKP. And by using those tapped phones, they were able to bring cases against people that might have brought a coup, might have helped stage a military coup against the Erdogan government. And so that helped settle, well, for one, it helped solidify democratization, but it also helped protect the rule of Erdogan. Later on, though, people became uncomfortable with the degree to which Erdogan was centralizing power, including these Gulenists, and so then they started tapping his phones. And so one of the famous releases was Erdogan talking to his son about how to launder money, which was a little incriminating. And so after that, Erdogan turned on them, and ever since, he's kind of had a blood feud going on with these people. And so when the coup happened, that was the excuse to kind of take the gloves off and really go after them. He'd already been purging some government positions every few months of, some number of people that they had lists of. It's suspected that they just have lists of these people and wait for excuses to get rid of them. And they've been doing that intermittently for the past few years. But after the coup, that was seen as a green light to just completely go through all of these lists and go after these people with wild abandon. Mm-hmm. So that's been more the response to the coup. The decree is more a response to the success of the constitutional referendum on whether Turkey should become a presidential system. That succeeded. They need to change they need to actually get around to changing the constitution. That comes later. But apparently, from what I read, he got impatient and just decided to try to make some superficial reforms to give him more power sooner. Why he wants to do that is a little unclear, but for someone like Erdogan, you can never have enough power. Or so it would seem. Let's see, next question was, this is pretty off topic, but given that we're talking sports, do I have any insight on publicly funded stadiums for major sports franchises? I mean, in general, it's... On the one hand, there's this argument that they generate economic activity and that they contribute to the economy. That's not really true. I think the research is kind of mixed on that. And I don't think I don't think if you want economic development, building a stadium is the best use of money. I think there's other things you can do. But on the other hand, there is the argument that even if there's not a lot of economic stimulus, that having a sports team has value in and of itself that can't be monetized. People really enjoy, where I live, for example, in Dallas, Texas, people really, really enjoy the Dallas Cowboys. That's practically a cult here. So, if there is a value to that beyond just what you can put on a price tag. So in that sense, if you really love a given sport or have a team that you love and you really want to keep them, maybe there is value in that sense in building a stadium or some such thing. I've heard that argument. That's one economic argument. But on the other hand, if you're not that interested in it, then don't really be swayed by this argument that it's going to be like a big boon to the economy. Not really. Actually, that's a good transition to something else that I had in my notes here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, government competition for businesses, because there's been a couple stories in the news the past couple weeks on this. There's a company called Foxconn, and they came out and released a statement saying that they had a multi-billion-dollar investment that they're going to make, and they're basically asking cities for incentives, or packages of incentives, in order to sway them in terms of where they'll locate this. And they're saying right now that they're going to do it in Wisconsin, which some people said was a political decision because that's in the Rust Belt, and of course, a part of Donald Trump's voting base is in the Rust Belt. You know, these sort of maligned and beleaguered former factory workers. And so part of the incentive that Wisconsin gave involved some huge amount of money in order to try to lure Foxconn out there. But it's not clear that Foxconn will actually follow through with the investment. It's not, there's no guarantee they will, basically, that they'll ever use that subsidy to actually build this giant factory complex they're talking about. So it's kind of a gamble on the part of Wisconsin. Obviously, Wisconsin could use the investment, but, you know, really, in general, it would be better if states and localities, for that matter, would just let the market decide where people invest and not compete with each other, because that does cost public resources. You might not think that giving companies tax breaks represents a subsidy, because you're not actually giving them money, but you do have to pay for a tax break. You know, that's money out of the government's pocket, so you have to pay with a tax break, so to speak, with less spending. And so in that sense, you're actually losing money. And then sometimes the way the incentive deal is structured, you even lose money over the long term if you end up giving up too many subsidies or too many tax breaks. So I thought that was an interesting event. This Wisconsin factory kind of opened that discussion. And then there was something I was reading about today was that Amazon is talking about opening a second headquarters. And they were pretty brazen about just saying local incentives will be a big part of our decision. So basically saying, yeah, whoever gives us the most money. Yeah, the interesting thing I read in that article was that they may actually even already know what city they want to locate the new headquarters in, and that they just issued that statement saying that there will be a competition, basically, because they want there to be a bidding war. You know, there want to be a kind of auction such that the incentives get greater and greater as cities compete with each other, so that ideally their target city that they may already want to move to will offer them an even better deal than they would have if they just come out and said, all right, we're moving here. So there's a lot of game theory there for corporations. That's very positive for corporations. They can get lots of free goodies if they can talk different localities or states into believing that they're going to invest. And then it's very negative for the states and localities because they end up having to expend public resources for an investment that might have happened anyway, or that at least should have happened anyway. You know, if you're only investing in a place because of subsidies, you know, that's market distorting, basically. You know, really the market should just decide where these investments occur. Yeah, another example of that is the Texas Enterprise Fund. It was something we have here in Texas. It was something made, I think it was drawn up by the governor and okayed by the Texas Congress, and it basically involves a fund designed to incentivize companies, generally from California. They inordinately target companies in California, to incentivize companies from outside Texas to relocate to Texas. And the fund is meant to help pay for their transition costs of moving. And, you know, in a free market, supposedly free market state like Texas, it's a little bit hypocritical to give companies money to relocate, when really, if Texas were as competitive as it says it is, it would need that. I think a lot of companies do relocate here just for market reasons, but the Enterprise Fund is kind of, it's almost corrupt. There's a suspicion, and I think it actually was ruled unconstitutional finally this past year, because there's a suspicion that the companies that take money from the fund to relocate here end up giving a suspiciously large number of campaign contributions to the Republican Party in Texas.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so that's not official corruption. You can't really prove that, but it is a little iffy. And so the program finally was shot down. But those are all examples of the public competing with itself for private sector money, and that's not good economics. That's kind of the bottom line there. So there was a story from last week. I got a couple of stories from 2 weeks ago that I didn't get to. There was a ceasefire deal in eastern Lebanon. There's a small corner of eastern Lebanon that Islamic State managed to kind of seize control of. And the Lebanese government, or the Lebanese army rather, and Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon. If you don't know what Hezbollah is, it's this giant paramilitary organization that's based in southern Lebanon. It's principally Shia Muslim. I won't get into the whole Lebanese politics and Lebanese civil war, which I would have to kind of really explain Hezbollah, but suffice it to say, it's a huge militia in southern Lebanon that is actually larger and more powerful than the Lebanese army. So the Lebanese army and Hezbollah kind of teamed up with the Syrian army to surround this bit of Lebanese territory with IS in it and put pressure on it, and eventually, rather than just killing them, basically taking the territory, they signed a ceasefire deal. And the ceasefire deal involved the IS fighters in the town relocating, basically being given free passage to IS territory in eastern Syria. And so that deal was signed, they all got on trucks and they started transiting out on a freeway out to eastern Syria. Well, the United States found out about it and didn't like that. The policy of the United States is that the Islamic State is the principal enemy in Syria, and that all factions involved in the civil war, whatever side they're on, should focus on killing them wherever possible. Now, the United States, probably the government wanted to just bomb this convoy of IS fighters, but it was known that the IS fighters had brought their families with them, because the IS fighters were living in the town, and so they intermingled with the villagers or townspeople, whatever you want to call them, and so they took a lot of them with them. So the United States didn't want to kill a lot of quote-unquote innocent civilians, and so rather than attack the convoy directly, they actually blew up bridges along the route they were traveling to eastern Syria. And so the idea is to put pressure on the Syrian government, for one, to basically kill the people in the convoy, I guess is what they want them to do, or at least arrest them. But the United States can't quite bring itself to blow up the convoy itself, so it's just inhibiting their passage. I don't know that it's going to be impossible for them to find another route to eastern Syria. Maybe there's just a drone hovering over them watching their every movement, but for now it's kind of this bizarre equilibrium where the United States can't quite just kill them outright, but it doesn't want to just let them go either. So there's sort of this convoy that's in limbo in the Syrian desert somewhere. Yeah, the Lebanese government kind of had to go through some gymnastics because this could be interpreted as supporting, quote-unquote, a terrorist group. And that would disqualify the Lebanese government from financial aid from the United States, which it receives a good amount of. So in order to get around that, the Lebanese government justified the deal by, in terms of a swap of prisoners. There were some soldiers, Lebanese soldiers, who had been captured by the Islamic State and were being held, that the Lebanese government wanted, or at least wanted to know what happened to them. And so part of the ceasefire deal was that the Lebanese government got that. They got their soldiers back. So they couched the deal in those terms. It was a prisoner swap, not necessarily a full-blown sort of peace agreement with the Islamic State. Yeah, the Syrian civil war is kind of reaching its, well, at least the end game of its current phase, which is the phase that's focused on the Islamic State. They're wrapping up relatively quickly now, and so there's kind of an open question as to what happens when they're gone, and nobody really knows. It could be that the civil war starts back up in earnest, the Syrian government fighting the rebel groups in its northwest and southwest. But and then there would be the question, of course, of what the Kurds would do. Before the Islamic State really got to be a major problem in the Syrian civil war, the Kurds were basically neutral. They were just kind of sitting by and seeing what happened and just trying to keep everybody out of their territory. But the war could very well blow up again. On the other hand, it could just become a frozen conflict, where the current front lines are basically de facto new borders between statelets. I don't think anybody in Syria actually wants to partition Syria, though, so I don't think that's going to go anywhere. But if things freeze up the way they are now, then that could be the long-term equilibrium for the composition of Syria. And then, of course, there are other variables, like what the Turkish government wants to do and what the Russian government wants to do. You know, it may be that the Turkish government and maybe also the Saudis want to keep pushing the war in order to put pressure on the Syrian government, which is an ally of Iran, which they all hate. Well, the Saudis hate, not so much Turkey. But it would not be expensive, really, for them to do that. That's an easy option for them. They would need a lot of other pressure, some external pressure from some other source, like Russia, with regard to Russia or some other point of diplomatic leverage, in order to stop them from propagating the war further. Russia also has a problem, though, which is that the Syrian government is not under its full control. Russia has a lot of leverage with the Syrian government, but if the Syrian government doesn't want to stop fighting, they're not. And it won't matter if the Russian government, tries to negotiate a ceasefire on their behalf. If the Syrian government wants to keep fighting the civil war and try to reconquer the country, the parts of the country that it's lost, that's what's going to happen, whether the Russians like it or not. Because even if the Russians leave, the Syrians still have the Iranians. And the Iranians have been pretty implacable allies thus far. They'll probably stick by them regardless of what happens.
I have the map of Iraq, Syria, Turkey up. So the Kurds, as we've talked about before, are hill people. And basically hill people, they get pushed into the hills, not by their choice. That's kind of the unfortunate circumstance. Hills aren't great for agriculture and that sort of thing. So where are they? Are they like right on the border where those three countries meet? Is where the Kurds are most concentrated? It's not clearly marked on a map, but they have kind of their distribution.
So that little bit of Syria in the northeast that kind of juts outward, that little finger there, that's a Kurdish autonomous region. So that's probably the biggest single part of Syria, with the single largest population of Kurds. There's also concentrations along the border with Turkey, including in the I think in the northwest a bit, and then also continuing from that northeastern autonomous province in a small narrow belt along the border up until the Euphrates River. So those are two other areas where there are lots of Kurds. Yeah, there was a lot of angst on the part of Turkey about whether or not to intervene directly in Syria, because the Kurds in those two zones tried to link up. The Kurds in the pocket in the northwest tried to push east to link up with the Kurds in the east, who were also pushing west to meet them in the middle, kind of on the river Euphrates there. And the Turkish government was not comfortable with that at all. And so they actually intervened directly. They actually sent in their military. Nominally, the military was just there to help Syrian rebels. But of course, the Syrian rebels the Turkish military work with are generally paid for by the Turkish government or in some way or form. So they're very tightly intertwined. They intervened and pushed into Syria to try to make sure the Kurds were not able to link up all their territories and create a single contiguous Kurdish territory that could serve as the basis for an independent Kurdish Syrian state. Yeah, most of the conflict that Turkey has engaged in Syria has actually been with regard to Kurds. There's been a ceasefire in place in the northwestern part of Syria where most of the Turkish-backed rebels are. And between those rebels and the Syrian government for much of the past year and change, it's kind of been on and off, but it's been pretty consistent. And the Turks have been focusing more of their attention on the Kurds and trying to make sure they don't get too much power, don't expand too much.
So by northwest, do you mean it wouldn't be Aleppo? That's the capital, right?
Kind of more north of Aleppo, north or northeast. There's sort of like a
Azaz.
oddly shaped, it's kind of an oval-shaped pocket of them there. Yeah, it's not all of the northwest, but there is like a big pocket somewhere, like a big circle. Yeah, it's hard to kind of describe because it doesn't really adhere to the border exactly.
Yeah, as ethnic groups tend to do, they're kind of distributed over areas. And we talked, I think it was 2 weeks ago, about my viola instructor as being of Spanish lineage. That's like Spain Spanish, not speaking Spanish, just that. But his family was split, and I'll go over to Texas. He was split by the Texas-Mexico border, so I don't remember exactly what the place is called. But Texas used to be entirely controlled by Mexico, and it was lost. We have the story of the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto and stuff. Basically, it's European English-speaking migrants who are squatting on Mexican territory in the north. And Texas is pretty hellish and hot. In the summer, we've talked about the air conditioning boom and the oil boom and a bunch of different reasons that people came to Texas. But it's not super great, especially in the summer, just to live here. So if Mexico kind of hasn't heavily populated Texas yet, new pioneers and settlers can squat, and then they want to keep what's theirs, and you have fights and stuff. And then now we have the Rio Grande River as the geographical object that kind of cuts these two pieces apart. But it used to all be Mexico, so there were a lot of people who migrated over, like his family, from Spain, and they occupied either side of the river, and they were all just one happy little tribe. And then it gets cut in half, and we have the border fence and stuff, and you can cross the border from Mexico to Texas and back, but it is a pain in the ass. That's kind of the progress that's been made, is they make that distribution of people more restricted to their respective side.
Yeah, that there was a big border dispute for a long time there. I think it was specifically because there were Mexican families on both sides of the Rio Grande, or at least partly for that reason. Maybe it was just for territory. The Mexican government, after Texas independence, claimed that the border between Mexico and Texas was along the Nueces, I think, river, which was far sort of northeast of the Rio Grande, eaten up a good chunk of far western Texas. The Texans, for their part, claimed it was definitely the Rio Grande, because of course they did. a lot more territory if the border is at the Rio Grande.
Nueces River, I'm trying to find that.
Yeah, maybe I've got the name wrong. I'm not exactly sure. Something like that, I think.
That's one of the things that is interesting about Texas is we have some rivers, but it's not a very watery place, assuming we don't get hit by a hurricane. We have a bunch of lakes now, and I think we're maybe second or third in terms of just water in the state, but that's all man-made. We just build lakes because, it's fun to go boating. We don't have lakes. It's really hot here. Let's make some lakes. So they're kind of the muddy, brownish lakes. They're not particularly beautiful. You have places like lakes in the Pacific Northwest where they have a rocky bottom, and that kind of keeps the dirt below the rocks, and the water looks very clear. Ours is just like mud at the bottom. Kind of gross, but you can cool off in the summer with those lakes.
Yeah, a lot of the lakes up here in Dallas are actually reservoirs that were constructed in the 20th century to make sure there was enough water for the growing population. And there are no, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, there are no natural lakes in Texas. Is that right?
I think there's one. There's one natural lake. I think Pac knows what it is. So there's one natural lake, and the rest of them are artificial. Giant mud puddles. Yep. We call them lakes here.
Yeah, bit of water trivia with regard to Texas. Texas is one of the few parts of the United States east of the Rockies that does not drain into the Mississippi Basin. Texas rivers actually drain directly into the Gulf of Mexico because we're special like that. Texas actually also has its own electrical grid. It's actually separated from the national grid.
Do you have the east, west, Rockies in Texas or something?
Yeah, something like that. I think it had to do with the liberalization of the electrical market here in Texas. It just kind of evolved differently and separately from everybody else.
We have some natural barriers that kind of make Texas almost a bit of a subcontinent. It's not the same as like Himalayas and India, but
Yeah.
we have the Mississippi River, and then states like Louisiana are very swampy, so it's not super great transitioning around in those areas. And then West Texas is super arid. It's a bunch of big desert areas, and there's almost nothing in the Panhandle. So it kind of ends up being its own region just because there's a bunch of geographical obstacles around it.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty accurate. You know, if you look at Texas, the demographics of Texas, most of the population lives in a triangle. At the top of the triangle is the DFW, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metro, and then Houston is sort of the bottom right, and then San Antonio is the bottom left. Vast majority of people Texas live in either one of those three metro areas or in one of the cities along between them. Austin, for example, is basically almost right between Dallas and San Antonio. Well, I mean, not exactly between, but it's on the way. Closer to San Antonio, easily. Yeah, and then the rest of Texas is relatively empty. Not that densely populated. And I think some people were even talking about trying to build a passenger rail route between the three cities here in Texas. I don't know if that'll work. It'll take a lot of money, and I don't think the Texas government is going to help them.
Who will pay for it? The golden question of infrastructure projects.
Yeah, Texas government is a lot more excited about toll roads than it is about mass transit.
We have lots of those toll roads. That's one of the things we're also famous for, is the speed limits are much, much higher. You can go 85 miles per hour on some roads, I believe, which is quite fast. Some
pretty
states
much
only
goes
go up to around, what, 65? It's a pretty big difference.
I mean, what I was taught is that you just go with the flow of traffic.
Yeah.
So near as I can tell, there actually aren't any speed limits on Texas freeways. You just kind of go. I've never been pulled over, and I've gone pretty fast on the freeway before, well in advance of the speed limit, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it. Yeah, it's different states have different ways of enforcing traffic laws, and some are more lenient and liberal than others.
I've had a speeding ticket or two. I think I've been pulled over twice. But you can do defensive driving in Texas, which is you agree to take a very, very boring online course where they go over a lot of the basics of why you need to go certain speeds and this and that. And it takes a huge chunk out of the cost of the speeding ticket. I think if you, say for example, went about 20 over the speed limit, it's more percentage based, but just for an example, 20 over, it could be a couple $100 for the speeding ticket. And if you take the defensive driving course, you pay that website, and that's its own kind of business, and that'll probably be around $50, so it cuts it down quite a lot.
Yeah, in Russia, you could just bribe somebody. I don't know if that's still true, but that's what I read about, I guess 10 years ago. You could, because I know about this because libertarians here in the United States consider it actually a superior system, where if you get pulled over, you just bribe the policeman on the spot, and that's basically you paying your ticket.
Yeah.
Much more efficient than going through the process, going through the courts and all that stuff.
The boring courts. Yeah, here in the U.S. we have penalties for attempting to bribe a police officer. I'm sure there are lots of cases where you can successfully bribe a police officer, but it's supposed to be against the rules here.
Yeah, I don't know that a lot of people do it. Police here in Texas are not really particularly well paid. They don't have really great salaries, but I think in general it's enough. In societies where there are enough economic opportunities, there's not as much incentive to bribe. If you can get a pretty decent job, people who get into the civil service then are generally there because they want to be, and not because they want the money or need the money. Because the people who get into civil service because they need money, those are generally people that I think are more prone to corruption.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because it's more money.
Yeah. And to be fair, that's speculation on my part. I haven't read research on that, but that's my intuition. Because I know in other countries where there's not as many economic opportunities, they do have more of a problem with that. We had a few more questions, but before I pop into them, I wanted to take a second to thank... Not sure how to pronounce his screen name. It was something like Vatui or Vatuil.
Vatuel, yeah.
There you go, Vatuel. Yeah, he was on last week, and he was very active in chat, elaborating and correcting me on some of the stuff we were talking about last week with regard to missile defense and other military systems. So thanks to him for helping me out there and correcting me and keeping me honest.
Hype.
It was,
Hype.
Yeah, he did a good job. I was impressed. I'm happy to be correct. Anybody who, if I say something dumb, I want to know about it. So, by all means, correct me in chat if I say something stupid. I'll add this disclaimer because I add it every week. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about, and I try to be clear about, the degree of knowledge that I'm speaking from when I talk about something. But not everything I'm an expert in. So, feel free to add in chat if you have something to add or some clarification or some such. So with that said, let's see, do I believe that a Kurdish independent state is even close to feasible? I think it's feasible, and we actually had this conversation a couple weeks ago. I do think a Kurdish state would be feasible. They could have one. I mean, they almost already have one. The Kurdish autonomous region in Iraq is pretty much independent, mostly independent of the Iraqi government. They still nominally recognize the authority of the Iraqi government, so it's not an independent state. But if they did decide to declare independence, they wouldn't really have to make many additions to their current autonomous government apparatus in order to reach the capacity of an independent state. So in that sense, it's definitely feasible. Whether or not it's likely, or whether or not it would last very long after independence is more the question that I would have. Kurdistan, I imagine that's what it would be called, if it became an independent state, would be completely surrounded, landlocked basically, and it would depend on the countries around it to export its oil, because it does have a fair amount of oil. And that's a problem because the states around a hypothetical Kurdistan would be Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and possibly Syria, none of which are countries that really want an independent Kurdish state. In the case of Iraq, a good chunk of the country's oil supply is on Kurdish territory, and they're not going to let that go without a fight, most likely. That's a chunk of the government's budget. Turkey, for its part, has a problem with Kurdish separatists that it's very sensitive about. And an independent Kurdistan could encourage and embolden the PKK, the Kurdish rebel group in Turkey, which the Turkish government would not want. And then Iran also has an issue with Kurdish separatists. Syria to a lesser degree, but Syria wouldn't be in as much a position to do anything about it anyway, given its current state. But Iran, Turkey, and Iraq, those are pretty powerful countries in the region. And those would be powerful enemies to have and to be dependent on, because again, they would have to allow Kurdish to export oil to come through their territory. And if they didn't want an independent Kurdistan, all they would have to do is not allow that, to put a lot of pressure on them. And if that didn't work, they could just invade. There wouldn't be a whole lot to stop them. I mean, the Kurds are pretty good, have a reputation for being pretty good fighters, but I don't think they could withstand an invasion of, say, the Turkish military, which is probably the most powerful military in the region, or the Iranian or even the Iraqi military, if the Iraqi military worked with the popular mobilization units, the Shia militias that they work with. So altogether, those are pretty long odds for what would be a pretty small, relatively weak state, surrounded by enemies. So in that sense, I don't think it would be workable in the long run. I think certainly one of those more powerful neighbors would either pressure the Kurds not to declare independence, or if they did declare independence, immediately take it from them. So it's more the diplomatic problem. Somebody a couple weeks ago was saying that wouldn't the United States protect an independent Kurdistan? Wouldn't the United States want to have another ally in the region like Israel? And my counter argument to that is that Israel has not been like a shining beacon, a shining example that the United States would really want to emulate. I mean, on the one hand, Israel is a steadfast American ally in the region, but on the other hand, supporting Israel in the region has required an immense amount of diplomatic capital that has many, many times over the past half century put the United States in a very awkward position diplomatically vis-a-vis the majority Arab population in the Middle East. So I don't think the United States would really seek out another situation like that where it was stuck having to protect a very small dependent country from very powerful neighbors. Powerful neighbors, mind you, that the United States wants good relations with. The United States doesn't really want and can't really afford at this point to really alienate all of the major powers in the Middle East any more than it already has. So in that sense, I don't think the United States is going to come in on a white horse and save the day for Kurdistan. So overall, technically, I think from an administrative standpoint, it would be feasible, but from a diplomatic international relations perspective, not so much feasible. So the next question was, given that predictions include mass extinction and displacement, as well as all major cities being underwater, would you consider climate change the single most pivotal factor in modern human history? It can be pretty important. It's been very important before over the course of human history, and so it can definitely be again. So maybe, yes. It just depends on how it plays out going forward, how dramatic it becomes. I don't know if it's the single most pivotal factor. There are certainly other factors. There are political factors that have had major influences on the course of history. The rise of communism and, liberalism. Communism kind of came out of liberalism. It's kind of an extreme variant thereof. There have been, obviously economics also had a major factor, structural changes in the economy in terms of how goods are produced and how they're distributed. The Industrial Revolution, for example, have had massive effects on the history of humanity that continue unabated. And then there are social changes like religion and things like that. So those there are lots of different factors. So I wouldn't call it the single one most pivotal factor, but I would definitely rank it up there. It's definitely been a major historical force. And then the next one was, do I have a take on funding for Pakistan? My understanding is that U.S. funding for Pakistan keeps them from turning on U.S. interests entirely. Yeah, the United States kind of has funded the Pakistani military, nominally the Pakistani government, but effectively it's military aid, so it's to the military. Yeah, that's kind of been part of the Pakistan-U.S. alliance for the past several decades. And it's kind of waxed and waned with the state of relations between Pakistan and the United States. If you talk to Pakistanis, there's kind of a love-hate relationship with the U.S. because on the one hand, we've been a tremendous benefactor over time at various periods, but we've also been a little bit unreliable at times. I don't know how many Americans know this, but the United States was actually in a NATO-like organization with Pakistan. It was called, that was some weird name, Middle East Treaty, or Baghdad Treaty, I think, Baghdad Organization, I think it was called. And it was basically Turkey, Pakistan, Iraq, and then I think Britain, France, and the United States, all together guaranteeing each other's security. And then Pakistan was also in a similar treaty called SEATO, which consisted of the United States and I think the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, France, and I don't think South Vietnam ever ended up joining. But then Pakistan was also a member of that treaty organization. So Pakistan and the US were in two different mutual treaty organizations, and yet when India staged a quote-unquote humanitarian intervention into Bangladesh that ended with Bangladesh's independence, because Bangladesh, we talked about this before, was originally a part of Pakistan. It was called East Pakistan at that time. And for reasons we've talked about before, Pakistan, there was a war in Bangladesh between the West Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis. And the Indians stepped in and basically ejected the Pakistani army from Bangladesh. And thus Pakistan lost basically half of its population. Bangladesh has a tremendous population. Lost half its population and a good chunk of its territory. So when the Indians attacked, the Pakistani government said, hey, we're under attack. Where are our treaty allies? You're going to help us out, right? And the United States was sort of not really interested in doing that. Didn't really want to piss off India, which was kind of leaned Soviet in the Cold War, but was not an explicit Soviet ally per se. They had strong relations, but beyond that, not an explicit ally. And there was a fear that if the United States intervened, it would drive the Indians firmly into the Eastern Bloc, into the Soviet camp of the Cold War. And also, it just would have been very difficult logistically to fight the Indian military, which was very large and already there. The United States was kind of busy with the Vietnam War at the time. I think that wasn't too far from the peak troop deployment to Vietnam, which was something like 500,000 troops. So the United States was a little tied down and really have the resources to go and do that. So the Pakistanis were very disappointed in that, such that they actually left the treaty organization after that. If you're not going to come and help us when we have a war with our greatest rival, India, then why the hell are we in this alliance with you? So forget it. And they left. But after that, after a trough in relations picked up again because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, if you want to call that an invasion. That's a whole other discussion we could have. But the relations picked up again, and the United States started siphoning resources to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan via Pakistan's intelligence agency, the notorious ISI, Inter-Services Directorate or something. Whatever it was. The ISI is Pakistan's intelligence agency. And so relations picked up through the 80s because of the war in Afghanistan, and things have kind of been up and down since then, since there hasn't been as much of a main common unifying enemy since the end of the Cold War. The war on terrorism nominally gave the United States and Pakistan an excuse to rekindle the relationship. At the start, that was with General Musharraf, when he was in charge, after he seized control of the government in a coup in 1999, I want to say, maybe it was 2000, something around there. So the United States sent a lot more resources in order to help the Pakistani government build counterterrorism capacity. And that worked for a while, but then it also became apparent that the Pakistanis were not entirely willing to part ways with the Taliban, among other groups, and that they were nominally giving them support in a continuing guerrilla war against the United States there. We've talked about this before as well. So in terms of funding Pakistan, not to retread that whole discussion again, but basically one of the principal ways the United States could pressure Pakistan to stop supporting the Taliban and other rebel groups in Afghanistan, and instead of supporting their war effort, pressure them into a peace agreement that could end the war, or at least tamper down violence there. One of the principal ways to do that would be to threaten military aid, as well as threaten economic sanctions. I don't think you could just remove the military aid, because Pakistan actually also has a very deep strategic alliance. In fact, it's much deeper than the one with the US, with China. And so if the United States gives up, well, on the one hand, if the United States pulls that funding, the Pakistanis will be worse off and more dependent on China. But then that's also a downside for the United States, because then it loses that leverage. And then it also loses basically Pakistan as an ally. It just firmly pushes them into the Chinese camp. Whereas now we at least have some leverage. Well, I say we. The United States government would have that leverage. That military aid could be used as leverage in order to try to coerce the Pakistani government. It's a kind of a one and done thing. If you pull it completely, then it's done. If it doesn't, and if that doesn't work in coercing Pakistani behavior and influencing their behavior, you don't really have anything else. And then they can just go to the Chinese and say, all right, well, we're ready to deepen our strategic ties because the United States has all but abandoned us. And I don't think the United States wants to lose its leverage or push Pakistan firmly into a Chinese alliance. So I don't think it's likely, but I do think that's probably about the only thing that could influence their behavior as far as supporting groups in Afghanistan. So that's my take on it. If you're asking more for the history of it, I basically also gave that. It's kind of a legacy of the Cold War, as well as the war on terrorism. So the degree to which the United States sends funds generally just depends on how good an ally Pakistan seems to be and the degree to which the United States feels it needs leverage with them. So let's see, the next one was, does the recent agreement between France, Germany, and China foreshadow a deterioration of relations between the US and Europe? And he references an agreement that would be a collaboration to eliminate gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles. Yeah, I don't think the relations will deteriorate between the US and Europe for that reason. There might be some other reasons, but, well, you're asking if it foreshadows a deterioration, not necessarily for that reason. So, yeah, it could be that European, Euro-American relations do deteriorate in the future, but I think that would probably be more because of something the Trump administration did. You know, as always, the Trump administration is unpredictable. Nobody quite knows what Donald Trump is going to do, or what whim he may base a decision on at any given time with regard to something like the alliance with Europe, something like NATO. So it's a little unclear, and it's difficult to make a prediction because of that uncertainty. Just in terms of warming relations between Europe and China, would that lead to a deterioration in relations? I doubt it. In fact, it would probably cause the opposite. Seeing Europe become more cozy, so to speak, with China would probably act as an impetus for the United States to try to repair relations. And again, that's subject to the whims of El Presidente, but who's to say? You know, reasonably speaking, if he listened to the advice of his foreign policy people, they would probably recommend to him that in the event of a warming relationship between China and Europe, that it would behoove American interests to try to improve relations with Europe in turn. I don't think better relations between Europe and China are really that threatening, though, to the United States, if only because the basis for that warming of relations is predicated on maintaining and propagating liberal economic ties, or liberalizing further what trade already exists. So in that sense, that's not a bad thing. You know, that, again, a liberal economic order is in the interest of the United States, because the United States is the world's premier trading power, basically. It's kind of a giant maritime republic on a continental scale. So, you know, although there are many people in the United States who are skeptical about globalization, certainly the Trump himself, among others in the administration, I think America's interests are best served by maintaining that open trade. And so in so much as Europe and China agree to work together to try to maintain that and propagate it, I think that only really works in the United States' favor. So that's not a bad thing, I don't think. Again, the principal factor there, I think, will be just the Trump administration itself. They could do something, whatever it may be, you know, make a point of focusing on trade deficits and things like that, and maybe that could be an impetus for a deterioration of relations. But even then, I think there's a limit to how far the administration would go, and I think Europe would try to do what it could to limit any such effort, try to act as a brake, so to speak, on some of the broader protectionist ambitions on the part of some in the administration. Let's see. So then the next one was, do I believe Trump will find a way to keep all the dreamers from getting deported and work with Congress to actually make that possible? Or does he believe he is just saying he will cover up him actually being the reason for it? I was reading a little bit about this today, and what I read was that the Trump administration, or more accurately, Donald Trump himself, basically kicked the decision over to Congress. Rather than saying, we're going to deport all dreamers, we're going to scrap DACA and deport all of the dreamers. Rather, he said, we're going to bring the DACA program to an end 6 months from now. And in the interim, it's up to Congress to come up with a replacement. So he's kind of passed the ball, so to speak, or passed the buck, as the old saying in the United States goes. He's kind of put the impetus on Congress to try and solve that problem. So I don't think he's trying, well, to a degree he's covering it up. He's trying to get rid of the program without getting the blame. So in that sense, yes, you're right in that manner. But whether or not they'll actually be deported or whether or not he actually wants to, I don't know. I think that Trump himself doesn't want to make the decision one way or the other, and that's why he's kicked the decision to Congress. So I think he's just sort of trying to score points with his base without taking any risks, which is a very typical risk-averse politician move. He's learning fast how to be a politician. So let's see, that's all the questions.
Yeah, dreamers are people who are brought into America illegally as children. It's the word that has been used for the policy.
Mm-hmm.
Basically people who are technically illegals, but they did not actively do the thing of entering the country. They were either born into it or brought into it before they were at the age of adulthood.
Yep, that's it in a nutshell.
It's been an interesting progression prehistorically and then historically, the age of adulthood and responsibility, and it's been gradually sliding to later and later in life. From used to be pretty much as soon as you hit puberty, you're an adult now and all the responsibilities of adulthood are bestowed upon you, to nowadays where some people are still living with their parents into their 30s, just based on how difficult it is to find specialized types of work, and also just the way that the pace has slowed down in life. From before, as soon as you reached adulthood, you probably had to help with keeping your tribe alive and going and raiding the neighboring villagers and shooting them with bows and arrows and stuff, and they need your muscle and your sweat on the ground. Whereas now a lot of our disciplines are based on your specialization in knowledge of how effectively you studied some hyper-specific domain. You didn't have the luxury of that before, because if you specialized in something and then the tribal conflict happens, then you're basically dead meat. You're not helping at all, unless you've innovated some type of weapon or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as economies grow more complex, there's more of a need to specialize.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the reason people are very dependent who live in cities or grow up in cities. There's not as much time and resources to learn all of the different things you need to take care of yourself, so you end up focusing on one thing and then basically trading production of that good or service that you specialize in for provision of needs, goods and services that you in turn need but don't have the specialized knowledge to produce and make for yourself. Yeah, given how complicated the world has gotten over the past few decades, it just seems to be exponentially adding more and more fields and technologies. You need to know more and more just in order to understand what's going on. I kind of wonder if there won't be something like an expanded high school, where you have a couple years of high school you have to do, or maybe some special college program that acts as a de facto extension of high school, just to have more time to introduce and familiarize children with all of the new aspects of modern civilization and the knowledge needed to operate and thrive therein.
Yeah, that's one of the general problems, though, with optimizing the time that we do spend in high school, because the process of giving people public education is an awesome concept, but the implementation of that is horribly inefficient in preparing people for the real world and teaching them what they need to know, giving them accurate information, and kind of helping them develop. Education is so awesome, but there's a lot of room to optimize it further and further, and then it's not equal across different regions. Like, some school systems are way better than others, they just have more more funding, they have better teachers, and then there's also the process of the norms changing over time as well, because certain populations will value education more than others, and that kind of causes an expanding divide in how much people value the time they spend in school. Because I know as a kid growing up, other people probably felt this too, there are certain days where you feel like what I've been presented with today is basically pointless. I'm never going to use this again. I don't really want to learn this. I'm not interested in it. So why am I here? Why am I doing this? Rather than understanding how awesome it is to be presented this information, and then also how learning this can help you learn other things moving forward. Because we're taught a lot of what about, okay, learn this now, learn this now, learn this now, rather than why we're learning this now and what the value of that is moving forward. Because you've got to inspire the people if you want them to be excited about their education. We take it for granted. Like if you and all your friends all go to the same school and you're in the same class, there's no one who's really presented a different opportunity that you can see in front of you. So you expect, oh, this is the standard thing and everyone gets this, so it's whatever. I'm not excited about it.
Yeah, and I think that's truer for some kids than others. I think, contrary to what people might think, there actually are some very, very good schools in the United States for primary education. It's just that not everybody has access to those.
Yeah.
So the people who get the best education, those kids generally do very well. And, to be fair, not all of that is the institution. Part of that is the family background. But, there's a lot of people in the United States who have access to mediocre education, kind of like how you described it, where you're just kind of treading water in terms of education, in terms of intellectual growth. Mm-hmm. You're just kind of there for the sake of being there.
There was also a trade school, which I don't know a whole lot about it, but it's kind of like a specialized post-high school schooling system that specifically teaches you crafts like automotive repair and plumbing and welding and specific trades that are still very important, but are not part of a high school curriculum. Mm-hmm. I know that Kukio's younger brother was interested in doing that. He went from high school and then he worked for a bit and wasn't super interested in going to university, and then he eventually went to community college, but that didn't really resonate with him, so that was another option where you get educated, but it's not quite the same kind of engaging in academia so much as learning some practical working skills that you can immediately apply in a job, a very clear job that you can just go out and seek.
Yeah, they're better about that in Europe, I think. I think Germany has a track system where, based on, I think, certain tests that you take, that they'll put you on track for, higher education, or they'll put you on track for technical education. Mm. And then if you end up in the technical education track, that's kind of where you'll end up in high school. Sort of in that sort of part of your education will be dedicated to preparing you for a trade of some kind, in that manner. Yeah, we don't so much have that here in the United States, unfortunately. And I remember Kukio himself actually advocating for them at one point. I think we had a conversation about that some years ago.
Well, one of the interesting things about getting an education is if you get a bachelor's degree or a master's and that sort of thing, the type of job that you can get isn't even totally obvious in a lot of cases. There are a lot of different jobs, and it's kind of like which one fits my interests and my knowledge the best. It's not a clear and easy answer a lot of the time. Like with my degree, I could have gone into a sort of research position, or I could have gone and tried to specialize in some type of counseling, like where I would do cognitive behavioral therapy for people who would come in, where it's not a medical profession, it's closer to being a psychologist, like a counselor for people. Which of those do you choose if you have a degree that applies to both?
Yeah, and that's partly why I try to encourage people to do extracurricular activities. Things like doing internships or, other equivalents. That just exposes you to the way of life, so to speak, that comes with working a job or career. Even if you don't get a perfect comprehension of it, at least it gives you an idea of what it's like and whether or not you would like it.
Mm-hmm.
That's better than basically just gambling on a given career, preparing for it, then getting into it, and then finding, oh, well, actually, all that effort was for nothing. I don't really like this. I want to do something else. You may or may not be in a position to do something else at that point. So it's best, and I wished I'd known this when I was in college, it's really best to try to get as much exposure as you can to different industries and different professions related to what you want to do, or even maybe not what you want to do. Just kind of go out there and see what there is. Just kind of explore, so to speak, different professions to see what resonates with you. Yeah, I didn't do that in college. I pretty much sat on my ass and played Civ 4. Got some good games in, but kind of paying for it now, so I wouldn't recommend that course.
I don't know. I think the Civ games especially kind of fits with your interest for thinking about how civilizations develop, and that's kind of your passion. And we've been gifted the patron of Kukyo, who gave us both a lot of time that we wouldn't otherwise have to specialize a bit further. And that's another cool aspect of even this next layer of specialization of mining information, because we have so much information with the internet now that you can do a lot of new things with that you couldn't before. Like the whole profession of streaming is basically brand new. It's been around for less than a decade, and it combines a lot of different elements. Like you described it as being an internet entrepreneur, but there's also the kind of TV channel aspect where you have to schedule certain things that draw viewers in and engage the viewership. And as a gamer, you also have the skill of your gameplay and how that kind of keeps people interested in that sort of thing. So it's a whole new world with the internet.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. You know, it's almost like a cafe where you come and kind of hang out, talk to people, and watch people game.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a unique new experience new experience that hasn't existed before. Yeah, it's pretty neat.
It pushes a lot of the social buttons for a lot of people, especially people who are more indoorsy or introverted, where they're not huge fans of going out in public places and talking with people who they don't know. They kind of prefer to be somewhere comfortable and safe that they know, and also be noticed. So it has that extra dimension beyond TV where you can make friends and you can watch a show, and the people who are making the show, they know you, they remember you, and they talk to you. There's a lot of that interaction that isn't present with watching Game of Thrones or something. With that, you have the interaction of talking with your friends about what happened in the show, but I don't think it's ever happened that the characters of the show talk to the viewers, breaking the fourth wall. Though that would be interesting if they did a twist and they started talking to Game of Thrones chat people. I would be amazed.
That would be pretty bizarre. Yeah, I remember, I think, like 10, 15 years ago, there was this experiment that Hollywood did where they had movies where during different scenes, critical parts of the plot, they would actually pause the movie and they would have a little gadget next to each seat, and you would actually get to vote on what you wanted to happen, what you wanted the characters to do.
Huh.
And then it was kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Based on the voting, the plot would go in the given direction that had been voted on, and the movie would unfold from there.
That's interesting. I didn't hear about that.
And I don't think anything ever came of it. And I heard about it maybe once, and then never heard of it again. Probably too expensive. Well, it takes a lot of effort to film scenes that never get used.
Mm-hmm. Or get used half the time. One of my favorite things in movies is when they give you partial information and the viewer gets to decide kind of by their own inferences that they make. Rather than filming two different endings, they have one kind of ambiguous ending, and you can talk with your friends about which way you think it went. I think that's fun. It's again, it's something that doesn't appeal to everyone, and if you watch the most popular films globally speaking, usually viewers prefer a straightforward plot where it's very clear what happened. a lot of people get kind of upset if they're confused and it's not super clear.
Yeah, I like those. You know, when I was a kid, many, many moons ago in the 90s, that was when I first got into anime. And anime back in the 90s was a bit different. It was very weird, what little we had on offer here. And I noticed that almost all of the endings to the shows I saw, generally OVAs and movies and things like that, they all had endings like that. They were all very ambiguous. And it got to the point where I just started calling those anime endings.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were just so weird and ambiguous. There was never any closure. Sometimes the movie just ended. There would be some degree of plot resolution, and rather than giving you any kind of epilogue, it was just, all right, you've had enough, fuck off.
Yeah. End. Okay.
Well, that doesn't have a lot to do with Egyptian military spending, but I'll jump into that real quick, since we have a pause in the questions going. So the United States gives a lot of money to Egypt, kind of in the vein of Pakistan. It's military aid, a fairly significant amount. The context is a bit different. The United States started giving military aid to Egypt as a result of the Camp David Accords, which was the peace negotiations that helped establish a nominal peace between Egypt and Israel after about 20-some years of on and off open hostilities. And the result has been, 35-some years of peace in the region, at least on the Sinai Peninsula, between Israel and Egypt. And part of the condition of that agreement was that the United States would pay military aid, would give Egypt military aid. The agreement also saw the Egyptian government kind of swap sides in the Cold War. They had been more or less an ally of the Soviet Union after the Camp David Accords. They switched over to the United States, seeing the U.S. as the stronger power in the region and wanting access to more resources, among them that military aid. So I bring it up because a couple weeks ago, the Trump administration actually held up a portion of that military aid. Apparently, the way the relevant law is written in the United States, 15% of the military aid package that the United States sends to Egypt every year can be withheld if the administration determines that insufficient progress has been made on human rights. And so, obviously, most of the money goes regardless, but the United States does make the occasional nominal nod to its claim that it is a power mostly interested in liberalism and democratization. Technically true, but not always something that's chased, something that is enforced with a lot of gusto as compared to pursuit of other interests, generally more tangible national security interests and economic interests. But it's there, and the Trump administration actually withheld that 15%. They didn't do it in quite the way you might think. If the United States determines insufficient progress on human rights has been made, the administration can give Egypt a waiver and then give them the money anyway, which is what happens pretty frequently. But what happened with the Trump administration is that they gave Egypt the waiver, but they also said that they weren't going to give them the money. They're actually going to redistribute the money to other programs. And they did that, they say, in response to a NGO law. NGO stands for non-government organization. The Egyptian government passed a law that basically made it very difficult for NGOs, especially NGOs that operate with funding from foreign governments, to continue to exist as legal entities within Egypt. And the Egyptian government, for its part, has a sort of suspicion of NGOs. They see them as destabilizing forces that push democratization and liberalism at the expense of stability. And so they're trying to kind of marginalize those groups with this law. And since a lot of those groups have American backing, have connections to the United States, the Trump administration has nominally sort of tapped the Egyptian government on the wrist by nominally denying them these funds. I think it's more of a symbolic gesture because, again, it's only 15% of the money. and they actually did give them the waiver. So that's kind of the signal that it's not too serious of an issue with the government. But the fact that they ended up not giving them the money anyway, redistributing it, that is something of a signal that if they at least want to see some progress, at least as far as NGOs that have American backing, which I imagine is what the Trump administration is more specifically focused on. On a related note, the Human Rights Watch, which is as the name implies, a human rights organization, an NGO, I think last week it was, accused the Egyptian government of propagating a quote-unquote assembly line of torture, which is a little intimidating. They've been, the Egyptian police state, such as it is, and specifically the police forces as an institution, have very little accountability. And they have a very incestuous relationship with the judicial system, which is actually filled out with mostly people who are veterans of the military or police force, and so don't have a lot of interest in propagating law or law and order per se, so much as they are in propagating the interests of the military and police forces. So there's kind of an interdependent relationship between the two institutions in that regard. And a lot of the uncouth, shall we say, methods used by the police, generally involving a whole litany of forms of torture, are used pretty systematically and regularly. It's almost a very normal thing for them to do when dealing with political dissidents. And the reason they do that is so that they can extract confessions, specifically recorded confessions. It's not enough for them just to make up an allegation, to just arrest you and say that you did something and then put you away on that. They actually want or need a videotaped confession from you. And so in order to coerce their arrested suspects to do that, that's where the torture comes in. That's the role played by torture in the process. And Human Rights Watch, among other organizations, last week laid out that allegation and cited some evidence. For those who might think that the Egyptian government is only focused on the Muslim Brotherhood, because I know some people have a lot of issues with that organization, it's not just Muslim Brotherhood activists that they're going after, although that is a big group that they focus on. They also go after liberals, people who want to liberalize the economy, and people want to liberalize the society, people want to make it less socially conservative. All of those people are also being targeted. Even nominally, people who would nominally be considered nationalists, who just want more democratic government or more accountability amongst the security forces, even those people have been targeted. So it really is just basically the military, in conjunction with their judicial allies, cracking down on political dissent of almost any kind in an effort to, as they say, quote unquote, pursue stability at any costs, or at all costs. So something to keep in mind basically whenever you read about Egypt in the news, because sometimes people argue that it's better to have an authoritarian government in power in Egypt to clamp down on Islamists and terrorism and whatnot. And, as we've talked about before, that's kind of an unfair dichotomy. Most of the terrorism and instability in the Middle East comes from the poor governance of the administrations and governments already in place, not from some exogenous factor, not from a lack of authoritarianism. It was the authoritarianism that was sort of the pre-existing condition, the factor that led to those issues in the first place. So I don't think propping them up is going to help that. Good governance is ultimately the solution there. And maybe that comes with an authoritarian government, maybe not. European liberalism stemmed from authoritarian kings embracing liberalism as an ideal and reforming their societies to lay the groundwork for democratic institutions. So certainly authoritarianism can give way to liberalism, but the Egyptian government shows no inclination to do so. It seems to be much more about protecting the vested interests of the powerful institutions in Egypt, again, that being the military and the judiciary.
Protect your investment, first rule of business.
Yeah, the military in Egypt has a lot of economic interests in the Egyptian economy. It's not just a national security institution. They also, by writ of law, by virtue of the laws passed by the Egyptian government, have control over various industries or large stakes in various industries. And in that way, they actually have a lot more power than just political power. They also have a lot of economic power, in so much as they basically act as this large de facto conglomerate that owns broad swaths of the Egyptian economy. Well, I don't know how interested people are in Brazilian electoral reform, but I read a bit about it.
What did you learn?
So we could throw this out there. So from what I read, the Brazilian political system is a bit unstable, partly because it has a multitude of political parties. It's very easy to form political parties. And they have something like 35 or so in Brazil right now. And the Temer government has introduced some reforms, or at least is pushing in that direction, to try and improve that state of affairs, try to introduce more stability into Brazilian politics. So part of that...
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, part of that reform involves just making it more difficult, raising the bar, so to speak, of winning an election and forming a political party, such that there's less competition, relatively less, and less unwieldy coalitions in government, in Brazil's government. You know, right now there's so many parties that you need to have, you know, several of them in your coalition in order to have enough power to pass legislation. And that leads to a lot of instability, because invariably somebody's unhappy and ends up abandoning the coalition or holding up some piece of legislation as leverage for something.
I was going to say, in the US we focus a lot on, is the two-party system a bad thing? It's like, are you dissatisfied with the two-party system in your country? Try Brazil's 35-party system. It's not confusing at all. And everybody wins, right?
Yeah, I mean, whether you have two parties or a multitude of parties, the underlying political calculus is still kind of the same. There's not necessarily going to be a whole lot of change regardless. You know, different constituencies have to negotiate with each other to try to settle their differences. That sort of underlies almost all political interactions, unless you have a very weird or particularly unrepresentative electoral system. Yeah, they were also looking at providing public funds for political campaigns, so basically campaign finance reforms, to try to reduce corruption, reduce corporate influence in Brazilian politics. Good luck with that. That's practically a tradition in Brazilian political culture, so that'll be very difficult to unwind.
Yeah, so that ends up being a little bit of a counterexample to the idea that the reason that US politics is corrupted is because there are two parties and people are paying them. It doesn't matter how many parties there are, you can pay politicians to get favors and get stuff done.
Yeah. Yeah, the powerful and influential tend to find ways of getting their interests represented. They're generally much more successful at it than other groups, less powerful groups. One of the really interesting things I read was that they were thinking about switching to a semi-presidential system or a parliamentary system. And the idea there would be to reduce tensions in Congress, since that system would kind of reduce the... Well, what happens in Brazil is that presidents rather, are very afraid of impeachment. And that's part of the reason that they have to build these large coalitions. And so by switching to a parliamentary system or a semi-presidential system, there's less of a need then. Because the president, the head of government rather, the head of state, in a parliamentary system is the same as whoever basically wins parliament. Whereas in Brazil's current system, that's not really the case. The president runs in a separate election, and the legislature is filled out in their own legislative election. So with a parliamentary system, you wouldn't have so much tension between president and legislature. They would be much more closely intertwined. It would be easier to work together. But that's apparently more of a long-term goal. Would be a very difficult reform to pass.
Only $5.99 to add 10 more political parties. Are you dissatisfied with the state of the world? With a motto and a flag and some t-shirts, you can make your own political party. That's all it takes.
So let's see, we had a question. Is the instability in Brazil going to lead to significant upheaval in the power balance in South America, i.e. will Argentina take a more central role? No, I don't think so, because Brazil is just so big. It is, Brazil is South America's 800-pound gorilla. It's so much larger, so much more powerful in terms of economic heft and political heft that even with everything that's been happening in Brazil, it's unlikely that they're going to lose their position as the preeminent Latin American country. Argentina, well, for one, Argentina has its own problems. Argentina is still trying to recover from the Kirchner administration, which passed a number of rules and regulations that somewhat restricted the Argentine economy. Among them were export restrictions, and Argentina is an export economy. It exports an immense amount of food products, agricultural products of one sort or another. And the Kirchner government's regulations limited Argentine producers' ability to export those goods. The intention, if I'm remembering it correctly, was to lower prices for those goods within Argentina by flooding the Argentine market with goods that had been exported to other countries. But because the Argentine economy was kind of dependent on those exports, the Argentine economy kind of took a dive. It wasn't a depression, but it was a fairly significant recession. And that, in addition to a number of other political scandals, which we might talk about at some point, in Argentina, led to Kirchner losing a lot of her support and the eventual rise to power of the current conservative government. Yeah, Argentina is the only other really powerful country in Latin America, I think, beyond Brazil. That would be probably first guess to the country that might take Brazil's place if something happened to Brazil. Venezuela is a mess, obviously, so can't be them. Colombia has been doing relatively well, but they're kind of off in a corner by themselves and do their own thing, and they're still kind of trying to recover from half a century of endemic civil war. They're just starting to begin that process of recovering from that.
Well, Chile is comparatively modern and strong for their size. It's a smaller country.
Yeah, they're relatively wealthy. In fact, they're almost developed status, such as the economic development there. But it's very concentrated into the middle part of the country. Most of the population lives in the middle third, because basically it's just a line, right? It's a line on the map. It's a very oddly shaped country. The bottom third is very cold, kind of tundra-like, and then the top third is mostly desert. And then the middle part is kind of semi-arid, livable. That's where most of the population lives, and that's where most of the economic wealth comes from. Obviously, the copper mines in the north also generate a lot of economic activity and wealth, but most of the people, again, live in, sort of the Santiago area. And even then, the population of the whole country is only something like, 6 million? Chile,
well, it's very mountainous.
Yeah, it's the western side of the Andes Mountain, basically. Oh, wow, it's more than that. It's 17 million. I was way off. There we go, 18 million as of 2060. Even so, that's much smaller than Brazil's, almost 200 million people now? And then Argentina has about, I think, 40 to 50 million people. So Chile, very prosperous in terms of GDP per capita, but the population is small and the geography is sufficiently limiting that it inhibits Chile's ability to project power in the region.
Kind of makes me think of Norway as a comparative example, where it's not a huge population. They're very modernized for their region. They're well off per person, but it's spread over a weird space, and yeah, like you said, they don't really project power. They're well off, but they don't project.
Yeah, kind of similar in that regard. Yeah, Chile actually has a history of, what was it? They have a strong military history. They actually went to war with, what was it? Peru and Bolivia, I think it was. And it was over that strip of territory in their far north where a lot of now. And it actually won that conflict. I think that was called the Pacific War, something to that effect. Yeah, Bolivia hasn't stopped complaining about it since. Bolivian nationalists are adamant that that stretch of territory belongs to Bolivia. In fact, the Bolivian government still maintains its navy. There is a Bolivian navy in this landlocked country in the middle of South America because they refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the loss of this territory. They refuse to recognize that it belongs to Chile now. And because that territory had given them access to the ocean, they maintain their navy as a kind of symbol of their resistance to that claim. Am I coming through all right? It looks like the connection is kind of failing a bit.
Yeah, it was getting a little bit robotic for a bit. I've still been able to hear pretty much everything you've said. I don't know if it's the quality of the internet went down a little bit or what. I was having problems with YouTube earlier for a couple hours.
It seems to have recovered.
Yep, sounds good now. We mentioned at the end of last week's session talking a little bit about the history of Thai politics and how we have the red shirts, yellow shirts nowadays, but how that kind of developed over time.
Yeah, we, let me see, I think we talked a little bit about it. Yeah, basically, in Thailand, most of the government's attention has focused on developing urban areas. And so the rural areas, especially in the east and northeast, kind of have been ignored, or at least neglected. And so that state of affairs was not considered abnormal. Much of Thai politics in the 20th century was basically different interest groups, you know, large economic interests, the military, and the judiciary, competing with each other for the country's principal resources, competing for power and resources. And, you know, rural folk, farmers and the like, don't really factor much into those kinds of power games. And that eventually changed later with a guy who was a telecommunications magnate. I think that's what he was. He was a guy named, what was it? Thaksin Shinawatra. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but that's off the top of my head. He made a fortune in telecommunications in Thailand and then got into politics. And his political platform was basically to cater to the wants and needs and desires of these traditionally neglected rural peoples, these rural areas of Thailand. And that proved to be enormously popular. And so he won, you know, he won big in the elections for that. And basically, ever since then, there's been this running rivalry between the traditional power elites in Thailand, again, the military, traditional business, and the judiciary, between that sort of trifecta of traditional power in Thailand and the new source of power, the new foci of power, that being Thaksin Shinwatra's political party, which tends to be more kind of socialist, more about welfare and providing benefits and infrastructure and money, government money to these rural areas. And the gist of the opposition from the urbanites, from the yellow shirts as they ended up being called, were the opponents of Shinawatra. The issue the yellow shirts had was corruption, which has long been a problem in Thailand. Political corruption has been a major issue in Thailand for, you know, decades and decades. And so Thaksin Shinawatra was seen as being no different. He was also seen as being corrupt, but he was also seen as having a lot more legitimacy, a lot more faith from the public. And that was a problem on the part of the yellow shirts because they thought that people in the rural areas were sort of out of ignorance, voting for a guy who was basically just trading for their votes with government benefits in exchange for the right to be in power and abuse that power, to be corrupt. And there is some merit to the corruption allegations that have been brought against him, so it's not like this was entirely made up or contrived. So there was a fear on the part of urbanites that this guy would just ride popular sentiment, would basically just buy with welfare benefits his way into power, more or less permanent power. But rather than adjust their political platform to try to win over votes from Thaksin, rather than try to change their own political platforms, they just sort of doubled down and criticized these rural political groups, who ended up being called red shirts, criticized them for fawning over Thaksin Shinawatra and being unprepared for democracy, as many of them criticized them for. So rather than kind of engaging with those rural people and rural political interests, they instead attacked them, and it turned into a severe example of hyper-partisanship. You know, as bad as you might think the United States is with partisanship, it doesn't compare with the mass protests that broke out in Thailand. And eventually there was a fair amount of violence that came of that, although it was kind of intermittent. And some people say the violence was overblown. Some of it maybe even faked, so that the military could have an excuse to launch a coup. Because again, the military was very anti-red shirt, anti-Thaksin, and so that was an opportunity for the military to step in and throw them out, which they did in 2006, I want to say. And this is after Thaksin Shinawatra had been exiled. He had been driven from power. But there was another election, and his party won again. So he continued basically to rule from afar in exile. And then that's when the partisanship broke out, the protests broke out. Thailand's economy is heavily dependent on tourism, so protests don't really help with that.
Yep.
So the military stepped in, overthrew the government for a while, and then held new elections, and lo and behold, Thaksin's party won again. So then they were back to square one, and the protests started up again. And so finally, just a few years ago, the military stepped in and launched another coup, and the military has been in control of Thailand ever since. They say they're going to hold elections again, but those elections keep getting kicked further and further down the road as they find new excuses to do so. I think part of the reasons they delayed them was the death of the Thai king, who has an important role in Thai politics. Thailand has a long-standing monarchy. If you know your history, you know that Thailand was never colonized by European powers. Greatly subject to their influence, but it was never outright colonized like its neighboring states were. And as a result, it has maintained the integrity of its monarchy. And the reason the Thai king is such a sensitive issue politically is actually kind of a recent phenomenon. You know, you may have heard of Thailand's very strict rules regarding criticism of the king and the royal family. It's actually very illegal to do that in Thailand. Any kind of criticism of the monarchy will land you in jail easily. And there's been some famous stories of people who post things on Facebook, fairly innocuous things, that the military interpreted to be sufficiently critical of the monarchy to warrant their arrest. And that brought down the wrath of a number of human rights organizations. Not that the Thai government particularly cared, but people were not very happy about that, outside of Thailand or in Thailand. But the Thai military has a pretty firm grip on power, and they have broad support amongst the yellow shirts. You know, the yellow shirts were actually very pro-coup and are not unhappy to see the military in power, given that the military is seen as a bulwark against the red shirts and the interests they represent. But going back to the king, there was a time when the king was actually very unpopular. Actually, the king was overthrown in the 1930s, I think, in a military coup because he was so unpopular because of reform measures he had taken that were negatively affecting a number of interest groups in Thailand at that time. And so Thailand was changed from something near an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, with the monarch having significantly diminished political powers. After that, over the next few decades, there was a whole slew of coups and counter-coups, and there's lots of coups in Thai history, modern Thai history. And so military government and authoritarianism was pretty much the rule of the day for much of that period between that initial coup up until probably the 1980s or 1990s. And what happened was in the 1970s, it would have been the late 70s, I think, there was a student movement, a student protest movement to try to pressure the military government to allow democracy. Because nominally Thailand was a democracy, but the military government did not allow like free and fair elections, or even very frequent elections for that matter, if I'm remembering this correctly. It's been a while. But there was a student movement, and then the Thai government, the Thai military specifically, cracked down on them. But before things could get too violent, the king of Thailand stepped in and pressured the military to step back and cool it. and try to negotiate with the student protesters. And that particular king, and I don't remember his name, but that particular king earned the eternal gratitude of the Thai people, and that actually restored the Thai monarchy to a place of preeminence in Thai society. The Thai monarchy was seen as being above politics, and an institution that looked after the well-being of Thailand as a country, rather than the parochial interests of the military, the judiciary, or what have you. And so in the 80s, then the Thai monarch, this guy did it again. Basically, he further pressured the military to allow elections and democratization after further protests. And I think it was the mid-late 80s. And that helped pave the way for the current phase of democratization in Thai history, which has seen a lot more political openness and democracy than the previous decades in the Cold War. Things were messy in the 90s and aughts, but for the most part it worked. And then, Thaksin Shinawatra and the hyper-partisanship in Bangkok and all of that happened, and now they're kind of having to rethink things. The military in particular is trying to kind of find a different path that isn't as open, and that preserves their power, which kind of goes unsaid, but is an implicit in a lot of what they do. For example, in the new Thai constitution, the military wrote special powers for itself. I think autonomy and national security matters, and a certain portion of seats in the parliament. That may sound familiar because you may remember the conversation from last week about the Burmese military, which did the same thing in the constitution that they wrote recently. So that's kind of the genesis of politics in Thailand and where it stands right now. Right now there's a fair amount of opposition amongst red shirts to the current military government and to the constitution they wrote. But at the same time, they don't have a lot of avenue, they don't have a lot of space in which to express their discontent. And it's unclear the degree to which they'll be able to reassert their political power. The yellow shirts, in turn, are pretty content with things because the country's quieted down, tourism has recovered, the economy has recovered. So things are going relatively well in urban Thailand. And that's where most of the yellow shirts are, so they're not terribly displeased with the current status quo. Yeah, whether or not that remains the case remains to be seen. Right now, the military keeps coming up with new excuses to kick elections further down the road, but eventually they're going to have to hold them, and it's unclear just what will happen at that point.
Do they have, I guess, history of them having coups often in the past, or is this more of a new thing in the longer term?
Oh yeah, a whole shit ton of coups. Makes Turkey look like a paragon of peace and prosperity.
Oh, so more than Turkey?
A lot, yeah, more than Turkey. Much more.
Oh, I thought it was going to be the most for like Turkey and Egypt and stuff, but Thailand's beating them out. Impressive.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Egypt hasn't had to resort to, the Egyptian military hasn't had to resort to coups very often. They basically had the one with Nasser in the 1950s, and that was pretty much all it took. They've pretty much been in the driver's seat ever since. Turkey has had a handful over the course of the past 40, 50 years. But Thailand, yeah, I think it's got the record. In the past century, it's something like 10 to 20.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. That's the result of a lot of competition within Thailand between interest groups, the military in particular, preeminent among them. And again, corruption is a big part of Thai political culture, unfortunately. They're working on that, but it's definitely an issue. And so one military guy will get into power, and then he'll be corrupt, and so then somebody else in the military will say, oh, well, this guy is an asshole, he's corrupt, let's get rid of him. I think I would do a much better job, and so then they get it, and then they're corrupt. And so then he gets unpopular, so then he says, all right, I'll give some democracy if you just chill out and leave me alone. So then there's a period of relative openness, democratization, and then the cycle kind of starts over again, and it just sort of vacillates between power of the military, power between business, and power of the people, depending on where the political winds are blowing, basically. And again, that was the big reason people loved the king before he died, I think last year or the year before that. That's why the Thai people really loved that king in particular, because he kind of broke that cycle. He kind of stepped in and pushed it more towards democratization and openness and away from authoritarianism.
Thanks, King. There was an article fairly recently about Japan and the daughter of the emperor who wants to marry a commoner, and that's going to cause her to lose her royal status. Just kind of interesting. I would guess that the Japanese emperor is pretty much purely symbolic and they don't actually do anything.
Yeah, that's exactly right. More to the point, a woman can't be emperor. And they were not willing to change that rule either. So, from the perspective of the imperial family, I don't think it's any great loss. You know, what they really need is male heirs that can continue the line. More of a loss for her, since she'll have to live as a commoner.
Yeah.
We'll
Which
see
I
how
would
that-
guess is still going to be very well off. I think the guy's like a law student or something. He's going to be very wealthy, and I would guess that she's going to still maintain a lot of her connections. So it's more about losing the status in word rather than in her lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we talked a bit about Kenya last week, so I wanted to follow that up with some elaboration. Basically, the election that was recently held in Kenya was overthrown. It was voided by the Supreme Court on the grounds of basically malfeasance on the part of the Electoral Commission responsible for actually carrying out the mechanics of the election. And I wanted to kind of touch a little bit on what exactly their criticisms were. Part of the Supreme Court's criticism was that the IEBC, which is this Electoral Commission, did not use the electronic transmission system that had been designed specifically for the counting of votes, specifically for the transmission of voting results from different parts of Kenya to the central IEBC control room, so to speak, for their counting. It was used to a degree, but a lot of the submissions of the forms that were supposed to be electronic were actually photos of forms that had been filled out on paper and then sent in. Or in one case that I read, it was actually just some lined paper like you would use to take notes in a college class that had some numbers scribbled on it, and then the picture was taken of that and sent through the electronic system. So that was considered not really quite kosher.
Yeah.
That was a little fishy. And then the official portal through which the results was reported was apparently not the official government portal. The government was using it, but then when the Supreme Court looked at some of their practices and asked the government, all right, is this the official portal? The government actually said, no, it's not. And that was a little weird because the government had promised that there would be an official portal on the internet through which you could see the results. But the government claimed that that wasn't it, and they didn't actually explain what the website was meant then to do.
Yeah. Very half-assed effort all around.
Well, either half-assed or suspicious, depending on how you want to look at it. The Supreme Court obviously was very suspicious. Let's see, there was also some problems with the actual counting of the votes. The opposition asked the government to give them the forms that are filled out for the different regions of Kenya that give results for the eventual total counting and tallying. The opposition asked for those forms, but the government says they're not ready to give them yet. So then the opposition asked, well, if they're not ready yet, then how can they have been ready for the actual counting? How could you announce the results if you don't have all of them already? And the government had said that, oh yeah, we totally had all of these forms and we've counted the result, here's the result. But then when somebody actually asked for them, oh yeah, we're not ready yet. We don't have all of them. So the government was unable to explain to the Supreme Court that disparity. At least not to the Supreme Court's satisfaction. And then of course the forms themselves a lot of the times were not the actual forms they were supposed to use. You know, some official forms, but some didn't have the appropriate serial numbers or barcodes. And again, some of them just written on paper. Yeah, lawyers for the IEBC apparently said that these were problems, but that they were not significant enough to actually warrant overthrowing the result of the election and demanding a new election. Supreme Court obviously disagreed. Yeah, the other question about that that arose out of this issue was why international election monitors had declared the election free and fair with no problems, and then have to be somewhat embarrassed by the Supreme Court saying, yeah, a lot of problems, we need to do this again. And for what I read, the disparity was because the election monitors were mostly focused on violence. Because there was a recent election in Kenya a few years ago in which there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of tribal and intercommunal violence. And so there was a real concern that would happen again. And so when the election monitors noted that that wasn't the case, it wasn't happening again, they just declared, okay, it's good. So kind of a low bar, though. That was the criticism they got, especially from African critics, that they were setting the bar very low for how they were gauging African democracy, and specifically Kenyan democracy. An absence of violence does not mean that there is not malfeasance, and so the criticism is that they should have been focusing a little more on the details of the electoral institutions in Kenya, rather than just purely are people killing each other on the street.
Yep. All right, now we're gonna have a nice election. Just as long as nobody dies, it's all good. All right.
So I've got a ton of topics here. I can keep going, and so we're a little slow on questions tonight, so that's not a problem. We can keep going if it's all right.
Yeah, we started a bit later, which one of the global aspects of doing this stream is we have Europeans and people from the Americas, and most Europeans are already well in bed at this point. It's like 6 or 7 in the morning for a lot of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have about 5 or so minutes left. The total runtime today for the stream is about to be 9 hours.
Oh,
Party on.
long day for you, huh?
Yeah, but it's been a pretty good one. I've had a lot of really awesome games during the discussion today. I have several engagements where I'm using infestors to steal really expensive enemy units during the big fights and stuff, and winning engagements where I have a lot less value, but I'm basically hiring a lot of their soldiers to fight for me, which is fun. Turning the tide. I started doing it just to kind of entertain the viewership a while back, and I was kind of doing this against really good players who I wouldn't normally beat, and I was beating them, and I was like, well, maybe this is actually good and I should do this when I'm trying to win seriously.
Huh.
And so now I still do it. It works in Grandmaster League. It's not just a joke.
Some gaming innovation there.
Yep.
Creative process. Yeah, that's neat.
It just started as a big joke, but then it turned into this. Excellent.
Yeah, a lot of great things kind of start out with similar humble. Penicillin was the story of penicillin is pretty similar. That was pretty much just an accident.
Mm-hmm. What were they trying to do?
I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically the researcher just left his shit out on the table without cleaning it up over a weekend. And then he came back and it was all moldy and nasty, and he studied it, and it turned out, oh hey, this has interesting antibacterial properties. And boom, that's how they found penicillin. Total accident.
Huh. I think fudge has a similar start to it as well, and that's where the name comes from. They were trying to make something else. I'm not sure if this is just a urban legend, but I think it was a process of making something else, and something went wrong along the chain, and they found it to be tasty and amazing, so they tried to recreate the mistake. And then we had the tastiness that is the fudge. Well, one of the things we got to do more this time was I opened Google Maps a bit more just to give some visual aids, because I don't think I pulled up the map of Chile, but you were talking about them fucking around with Bolivia and Peru. And most people who watch the stream, we have quite a few Brazilians, but overall it's going to be more of an American to European perspective. So just knowing the geography can be pretty nice in opening up the map. That was one of the cool things that you've done for us in a lot of the conversations, is you'll just draw some map for us so we have that visual aid to see what's going on in the area. So I'm going to pull up Chile real fast, because we talked about the the lay of the country. It's very long. It makes me wonder, what did they do for transportation? Because it seems like it's centralized in Santiago, like you said, and a lot of the population's in the middle, but it seems like having a train system or a big highway or some shit like that would be pretty beneficial. And they were fighting over something in the north with Bolivia and Peru, the Pacific War, like you were saying.
Yeah, it's that northern province there. Yeah, you can kind of almost see how it links up with the Bolivian borders. Yeah, Bolivia used to have a coast there on the Pacific, and it was kind of that area. And that's what Chile took from them. And that area also is very rich in copper, which makes the loss hurt all the more for Bolivian nationalists.
Yeah.
Because copper has been a really important resource in the modern economy, because, just every damn electronic uses some degree of copper. So it's been a big cash cow for the Chilean economy.
Yeah. And I would guess just for general strategic purposes, having access to the ocean would be a really important asset. So if you lose that, that's a major bummer.
Yeah, if you want to do any kind of international trade overseas, then you have to get Chile's permission, pretty much. And that's a strong leverage for Chile over Bolivia. That's not a good position if you're the landlocked country, wherever you are. We did get 2 more questions, and I'm not sure if we have time for them. Because you said 5 minutes, right?
Yeah. What are the 2? Instability in Brazil and African economies at risk of collapsing. We could tackle them. I think it's fine.
Okay. And I'll throw this in as an extra. This is weird news. It'll just take a second. There was a French father who had a daughter who's paraplegic and has some kind of nerve disorder, so she can't really feel much pain. And he put her to sleep one night, and then the next morning he woke up, went to her bedroom, and she was covered in blood, and it turns out that she'd been attacked by a horde of rats over the course of the night. And she was in bad shape, but she lived, took her to the hospital, but that was a pretty horrifying story. And some people were saying that resembled a scene from a game called The Witcher, apparently, where that apparently happened.
Oh, yeah. Have you played Witcher games?
I have not, but I've seen Kukio play them.
Yeah. They're pretty cool.
Yeah, so that's some nightmare fuel for the listener. I figured I'd throw that in for them. Packed Fact actually wanted me to comment on an article that she sent me. So I'll touch on that real quick. Basically, the article just asserted that Xi Jinping, the president of China right now, and the general secretary of the Communist Party of China, may try to change the Chinese constitution to remove term limits. The Chinese constitution is not exactly an ironclad legal document in China, because rule of law over there is kind of nominal. It's sort of the degree to which the Chinese justice system actually propagates and defends the Constitution, holds it up, is kind of at the discretion of the Communist Party. But in the Constitution, it very explicitly says that presidents can only serve for 2 terms, a maximum of 10 years, basically. And Xi Jinping may want to stay on longer than that. He's easily the strongest political leader in China since Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s. And he's made several indications by way of the political movements he's made in China over the past few years that he wants to solidify his power and remain in power for the long term. And so there's this open question as to whether he'll do that. One of the difficulties he'll face is kind of trying to upend this de facto power sharing arrangement that has been in place since the 1980s. After the Cultural Revolution, there was a lot of instability. Well, there's a lot of desire on the part of Chinese political elites to reach some kind of agreement, handshake agreement between themselves, to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. And I won't go into the Cultural Revolution, but basically it was a power play on the part of Mao and his people to try to wrench political power from some of their rivals in the government. So to prevent political competition from being reduced to that kind of state, there was an arrangement made in which basically one faction would rule for 10 years, and then control would be given over to the other faction for another 10 years. And the 2 factions very roughly consist of princelings, who are sort of these privileged elites, who are the sons and daughters of Communist Party elites from previous eras. of the party's history. And then on the other side, and this is very roughly speaking, these are very loose coalitions, but roughly on the other side are people who do not have those kinds of connections, who rather rose to prominence in the party via the Communist Party Youth League, which is the Communist Party of China's sort of youth organization through which they sort of train and introduce future Communist Party leaders to the art of governance.
Mm-hmm.
So that arrangement has worked pretty well up until now. Right now, the agreement is still nominally in place. It hasn't been broken, but already some of the norms that had been established have been broken. Normally, it's standard by now to make it clear who your successor is going to be. So generally, there would be somebody from that other faction. Xi Jinping is himself a princeling, so you would expect nominally for there to be some kind of Communist Party Youth League or some equivalent person from the opposing political groups in a preeminent position on the Politburo. Basically, the number 2 position on the Politburo should be somebody from the other faction who will succeed you after your 10-year term limit. That hasn't happened. Everybody on the Politburo that he's appointed and put there has been very strong allies of himself. And that based on the centralization of power in the presidency of China and to the General Secretary of the Communist Party are signs that he's going to continue to try to stay in power. So roughly speaking, that's some of the evidence that he's going to stay in power and the problem that he'll face, overcoming that agreement. Changing the constitution itself will not be a problem per se, but it represents an obstacle. You know, in a system like China, you never really know who your friends are. You never know who can turn on you because the politics are so opaque. So anything that requires you to very openly move and do something, like, say, change the constitution, that's innately dangerous because it means you're exposing yourself to political attack. He's concentrated a lot of power, so it might well be that he can get away with it, but it'll be a risk. And in a risk-averse political culture, that can lead to unexpected, unintended consequences. So that's a very quick and dirty read on that article that I sent Fact. You know, if she wants to talk more about it, I'm happy to maybe get into it a little more. In the interest of time, though, I'll skip ahead to this last question. Are African economies at risk of collapsing in the event of an economic meltdown in China? Not collapse, but certainly recession. You know, a lot of African economic development has been predicated on demand, which has increased a lot over the past few decades from the global market, but specifically from China. So a significant slowdown in China, or, you know, God forbid, an economic collapse, would significantly impact economic growth rates. I don't know if it would send it into an economic tailspin, per se, but it would negatively impact them. So I wouldn't say it's at risk of a collapsing, but maybe a recession, and it would certainly extend the prospect of achieving significant levels of development off far into the future, much farther than they are now, given how high current economic growth rates are.
Cool.
So sorry for keeping you up late. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, no problem. It's always good having you on. Maybe, I don't know if you two are cool with that, linking the article that you were talking about in case people want some further reading and context for that. Be cool.
Yeah, sure. I think we had it in
Discord.
Yeah, we had it in Discord.
Cool. Well, awesome. It's been another good conversation. A little bit slower on the questions because we're a little bit later. A little bit fewer people are awake around this time. But it's good every time, and this will be on YouTube in a playlist with the rest of them. I really like the map visual aid. I'll try and mix that in a little bit more. It's nice to also slow down the pace for me. If I'm playing games all day, it's nice to take some minute or two breaks here and there, and it helps a lot, I think, getting some visual context for the area that you're talking about, just to keep everything nice and straightforward, adding some extra dimensions to it.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
But thanks for having you on, and
Well,
we'll see
thanks
you
for having me.
next week.
Yep. See you next week.
Peace. You're welcome, Miscreant. Alrighty, duty. Let's find someone to host.